Hi, my name is Anthony, and along with Elia and Charles, I would like to present our study on the return of sport, how McKendree athletes are tackling the spring 2021 season, with a special thanks to Dr. Tammy Eggleston, our faculty supervisor. This spring, sports were able to return to activity in full for their respective seasons. Because of the pandemic, however, athletes were faced with unique and challenging guidelines and schedules to accommodate for safety regulations, including things like face coverings during activities, weekly testing, and daily screenings, to name a few. In light of these difficult new conditions, we look to find out the state of student athletes and how they are doing in both their sports and in their classes during a condensed and COVID-controlled season. We looked at previous research on related topics to help better understand the possible conditions of athletes in response to the pandemic and lack of activities. The potential risks of stress and inactivity were reiterated as these studies showed how long the break period of a canceled season and quarantines may have left people in depressive, stressed, or simply unprepared states as they return to school and to their sports. Aside from mental aspects, the physical detriment of canceled seasons and trainings, along with the irregular and potentially unhealthy eating and sleeping patterns, propose negative physical implications as well. In order to fully encapsulate the student-athlete experience during this spring season, we first wanted to determine how athletes are handling a condensed season. We also wanted to look at the academic side of things by analyzing the changes that occurred through online learning and their experience during the season. Next, we also wanted to compare mental states between this semester and the previous semesters during the pandemic. Finally, we wanted to contrast the difference between on-campus and off-campus sports in their returns this season. All 131 participants in our study are student athletes at McKendree University, aging 18 to 26. These participants were recruited through social media posts asking them to contact researchers in order to gain access to the survey which they would fill out. The survey given to participants is a two-section survey through Google Forms that consists of basic demographic questions, 14 multiple-choice questions answered using a 1 to 5 Likert scale, and concluding with a short answer question asking, "What have you learned during the COVID-19 pandemic?" The student athletes in the study were recruited through convenience sampling as they responded to social media posts asking for participation via completion of a survey. Upon fully reading and consenting to being a part of the study, these students then filled out the survey to completion and submitted.
Our group came up with 5 hypotheses. First, that off-campus athletes would have more free time to make athletic obligations like training, practice, therapies, stuff like that, than on-campus athletes. Our second hypothesis suggests that GPA would increase compared to the fall 2020 semester. The third and fourth hypotheses analyze if fewer face-to-face classes benefit one gender over the other either physically or mentally. And lastly, if athletes would comply if the NCAA mandated that they get vaccinated to play, more so female athletes over male athletes. Our demographic results showed that more males took our survey than females at 72.5%. The average age was 20.7 years old, and most athletes were on-campus athletes at 62.6%. Off-campus athletes are any athletes or a sport that practices or uses facilities off campus. This is like McKendree hockey, water polo, swim and dive, bass fishing, bowling. For class results, it was pretty even, but seniors had the majority at 33.6%. We used an independent samples t-test to test our first hypothesis, and we found that it was not significant. So off-campus athletes compared to on-campus athletes, there's no real significant difference in time they have to make athletic obligations. For our second hypothesis, we analyzed descriptive frequencies, and we can see that although many students said their GPA increased, the majority reported that it remained the same at 38.9%. Independent samples t-tests were used to test hypothesis number 3 and 4. There were no significant findings that suggest having fewer face-to-face classes benefits one gender over the other, mentally or physically. For hypothesis 5, most student athletes would agree to get vaccinated if the NCAA mandated it for competition. It was still a pretty even spread of responses. A lot of people did strongly disagree with the thought. Another independent samples t-test was used, and there was no significant results to determine that female athletes would agree more over male athletes. There are a couple interesting takeaways outside of our main hypotheses. We can see that having less face-to-face classes are causing student athletes more harm mentally and physically. There's also an increase in depression, anxiety, and fatigue levels. This could due part to a lot of teams competing this season. Pretty much everybody is competing at some point or another, so that could play a role on top of academic stress. It's also interesting to see that willingness to achieve goals has practically remained the same even though the seasons are condensed.
General findings. Athletes in general stated that they were not nervous to resume competition. We believe that prolonged time away from competitive sports could have caused anxiety among student athletes. The pandemic had very little impact on both academic and athletic goals set by student athletes. Student athletes reported that the measures in place for return to play were sensible and they felt comfortable following the guidelines. Interestingly, most athletes admitted that their mindset had changed for the better compared to last semester. Participants stated that they would support a notion of getting a vaccine before being able to return to sports. And finally, student athletes agreed that there was very little change in their academic success compared to previous semesters. So what are athletes saying? Well, to summarize, athletes believe that the impacts of COVID-19 had negatively affected them. Specifically, spending time in isolation hurt them mentally, while learning online was much harder to participate in. Key takeaways from the study include not taking your sport for granted as a student athlete, being proactive with physical and mental wellness, and finally, staying connected to family and friends. Despite the negatives, participants stated that they were able to adapt to life in lockdown by staying positive and managing time correctly. Discussion. Limitations to the study were inevitable due to the nature of COVID-19 and it being present on campus at the time of this study. The population used at McKendree was small, as researchers were unable to connect with all of the student athletes on campus. Secondly, the GPA grades recorded and used for our research were only midterm marks. Final grades were not recorded in this study. Lastly, it was important to remember that COVID-19 is very new to everyone. Participants were all affected differently, and this could lead to inconsistencies in the studies. There were no significant results recorded in this study, although trends were identified in the research, such as online learning is negatively affecting mental health. Also, results suggest that togetherness, mental and physical well-being, and the ability to adapt were all valuable traits and skills needed to help deal with COVID-19. Thank you for your interest in our presentation. To find similar McKendree presentations and related conversations, please visit www.facebook.com/MCKAED. Thank you.